The officer stopped the car and turned its driver into an object of ridicule. They mocked him, thinking they could do whatever they wanted, but the next morning they got a shock. The man they were making fun of turned out to be their new boss. Subscribe so you don't miss news stories, and don't forget to leave a comment. Where are you watching this from? We're interested to know. The night stretched out endlessly before Marcus Williams as his car glided down the deserted highway. Moonlight spilled across the narrow asphalt, its pale glow mingling with the beams from his headlights, illuminating the occasional road sign or crooked tree along the way. The rhythmic hum of the engine was a constant presence, but it could do little to quiet the thoughts racing through Marcus's mind. His fingers lightly drummed the steering wheel, not from nerves, but from anticipation. In a few hours, he would officially assume the position of police captain in a new town, a role that carried both opportunity and burden. He knew the small town ahead was no ordinary assignment. He had read between the lines of the brief he was given. The station he was about to command had a reputation unspoken, but well known. It was a place steeped in old ways, a department rumored to be resistant to change and tainted by undercurrents of racism. Marcus, however, had never been one to shy away from difficult tasks. This one he knew would push him in ways few assignments ever had. The road was quiet, the highway an endless ribbon unfurling through darkened woods and sleepy farm towns. Occasionally, a distant porch light flickered on far off on the edge of a field. Marcus adjusted his rearview mirror out of habit. Though there were no cars behind him, his only company was the faint hum of jazz playing through the car's speakers, a small comfort he had allowed himself for the journey. It had been a long time since he'd felt the need to prepare himself this carefully for a new post. Marcus had seen it all before. He had served in departments where his abilities were doubted from the start, where his skin color preceded him before he could even introduce himself. In the early days of his career, these moments had left him frustrated and angry, but over the years, he had learned to control that anger, temper it, and to resolve his father's words echoed in his mind. "You'll get there, son, but you've got to stay cooler than ice in the heat." His father, a retired sergeant, knew all too well the battles that came with wearing a badge while black, and now Marcus was ready to confront those battles head-on again. He was leaving behind a good position in the city, one where he had earned respect, though it hadn't come easily. Now he was walking into the unknown, a small-town police department that hadn't asked for him, but one that he was determined to change. Not by force, not by making enemies, but through persistent strategy and leadership. Still, he wasn't naive. He knew his presence alone would stir resentment in some quarters. Resentment that wouldn't be voiced openly, but would surface in small, cutting ways. He had learned to see those signs early, a joke at his expense during roll call, a missed invitation to an off-duty gathering, the cold shoulder from those unwilling to look beyond their own prejudices. A brief flash of frustration flickered in him. Why did it always have to be like this? Why was every new assignment a reminder that to many he was a captain second and a black man first? But he quickly pushed the thoughts away. He had work to do, and self-pity would not help him achieve it. The road dipped, winding through a patch of forest that closed in on both sides, the trees tall and dark, like silent sentinels. Marcus checked the GPS on his dashboard. Another 2 hours, maybe less. He glanced at the fuel gauge. Just over a quarter tank left. He would stop soon for gas and maybe grab a cup of coffee. The thought of hot coffee made him realize how long it had been since he'd taken a break. The miles passed quietly. Occasionally an 18-wheeler lumbered by in the opposite direction, headlights momentarily brightening the cab of Marcus's car before disappearing into the night. He thought about pulling over to stretch his legs, but decided against it. Something about this stretch of highway didn't feel welcoming. It was a kind of road where strangers were noticed, where questions might be asked, questions that he didn't feel like answering tonight. The darkness outside the windshield deepened, and with it, his thoughts drifted back to earlier moments in his career. There was the time when a senior officer had accidentally misplaced his paperwork, leaving Marcus to face a reprimand he didn't deserve. Then, there was the colleague who had gone out of his way to undermine him during a critical investigation, only to later claim it had been a misunderstanding through it all. Marcus had held his composure, never giving his detractors the satisfaction of seeing him break. They'll expect you to fold. His father had said, you can't give them that. Not even for a second, but this time felt different. He wasn't just joining a team, he was leading one. He would be the face of authority in a place where authority had likely always looked the same. Until now, he could feel the weight of it already pressing against his shoulders, like the night pressing in on the car. But Marcus welcomed the weight he reminded him while he was here. The jazz track ended, and the soft hiss of static filled the silence before the next song began. Marcus let out a slow breath, releasing the tension that had gathered in his chest. He wasn't nervous. No, not exactly. He was focused. It was the feeling of a man who knew the stakes were high, but who had ALSO learned that victory wasn't about winning every battle. It was about knowing which fights mattered most, and making sure he showed up ready for those up ahead. A gas station flickered into view, its neon lights buzzing faintly in the dark. Marcus debated stopping, but decided to keep driving. He had enough gas to reach the outskirts of town, and he didn't want to lose momentum. He adjusted his seat slightly, settling in for the final stretch. The closer he got to town, the more determined he became. Whatever lay ahead, hostility, prejudice, or outright defiance, he was ready for it. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, watching as the first faint hints of civilization appeared on the horizon. A distant water tower, a cluster of buildings huddled under the night sky. It wouldn't be long now. His thoughts shifted toward the officers he would soon meet, the station house he would walk into, and the changes he intended to bring. He knew there would be resistance, perhaps even hostility, but Marcus had never been one to back down. The night seemed to stretch out endlessly, but with every mile he was closer to the start of a new chapter in his career. He didn't know exactly what awaited him in the town ahead, but one thing was certain: change was coming, whether the officers at that station liked it or not, and Marcus Williams intended to lead it. The glow of red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror, piercing the calm of the road. Marcus felt his stomach drop slightly, though not from fear. He had been through this before. He was no stranger to the sensation that came with being pulled over by police, but it never got easier. The familiar sirens wailed behind him as a patrol car signaled him to pull over. The timing of this couldn't have been worse, really, Marcus muttered to himself, his eyes flicking between the flashing lights and the road ahead. He signaled and slowly guided his car to the shoulder, the crunch of gravel beneath his tires reverberating in the quiet night. He shifted into park, rested his hands calmly on the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. This was the last thing he needed, a confrontation, before he even officially arrived at his new post. The patrol car pulled in behind him, its lights still flashing, bathing the scene in red and blue. Marcus watched in his side mirror as two officers stepped out. They moved slowly, as if sizing him up before they even reached his window. The first officer, tall and stocky with a shaved head, approached from the driver's side. His partner, slightly shorter with an air of casual arrogance, took his time walking around the back of Marcus's car, inspecting it with deliberate disinterest. Marcus recognized the dynamic immediately. The lead officer, Officer Johnson, was the enforcer, while his partner, Officer Miller, played the role of the backup provocateur. Marcus had seen this play too many times to count. Johnson tapped on the driver's side window with a gloved hand, and Marcus rolled it down. Remaining calm, the officer leaned down, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but Marcus could see the smirk forming on his lips. Johnson didn't bother with a greeting, license, and registration. He barked, his voice laced with an edge of authority that went beyond simple procedure. Marcus handed over his documents without a word. Johnson took them, glancing briefly at the license before turning his attention back to Marcus. "What brings you out on this road so late?" Johnson asked, the smirk now evident as he glanced over Marcus's car. "This ride doesn't really seem like the type of man like you would be driving. Must have come from some good luck, huh?" Marcus suppressed a sigh. The insinuation was clear. "Just heading into town for work," he replied, keeping his voice even. "Is there a problem, officer?" Johnson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Marcus for a long moment, his eyes flicking between Marcus's face and the interior of the car, his partner. Miller finally approached the passenger side, his arms crossed, a lazy grin on his face as if he were already enjoying the interaction. "Work, huh?" Miller chimed in, his voice thick with mockery. "In a car like this, it must be some job." Marcus kept his gaze forward, his patience wearing thin, but his calm exterior unshaken. He had prepared for moments like these, moments when any show of frustration or defiance could escalate the situation. He knew the game they were playing. Johnson leaned in closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "Where are you coming from? Looks like you're not from around here, just passing through," Marcus answered in a measured tone. "I'll be starting a new position in town." Both officers exchanged glances, the smirks never leaving their faces. "Oh yeah?" Johnson said, raising an eyebrow. "And what kind of position would that be? Pretty sure we'd know if someone like you was moving in." Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened imperceptibly, but he remained composed. "You'll find out soon enough." Miller chuckled under his breath. "He's got secrets." "What do you think? Johnson thinks she's hiding something." Johnson smirked, leaned away from the window, and waved Arcus's documents in the air. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus paused for a moment. He could feel the tension. Realizing it wasn't about a routine stop anymore, he opened the door slowly, stepping out into the cool night air. The gravel crunched under his boots as he stood up, towering slightly over Johnson, though he made sure to keep his posture neutral. Johnson didn't seem to care about Marcus's height. He looked up at him with the same smug grin, as if he had already won whatever game they were playing. Iller circled around his eyes, raking over Marcus's car again, as if he expected to find something suspicious at any moment. "Ice heels," he commented sarcastically. "Bet this set you back a bit. Not bad for someone just passing through. Are you sure you can afford it?" Marcus remained silent. This wasn't the time to engage in a back and forth. He knew they were baiting him, hoping for a reaction that would justify further action. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Johnson stepped closer, his gaze shifting from Marcus's face to his chest as though sizing him up. "Why don't you tell us what kind of job B you're starting in town?" "I'm real." "Curious?" The air between them crackled with tension. Arcus could feel the weight of the moment, the subtle challenge in Johnson's voice, the taunt, and Miller. They were testing him, seeing how far they could push before something snapped. But Marcus had spent his entire career learning how to keep that something from snapping. "I'm a police officer," Mark said finally, his voice low but firm. "And starting tomorrow, I'll be your new captain for a split second." Johnson's expression faltered. It was brief, so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Marcus caught it. His smirk faded, replaced by something akin to confusion or disbelief. Hiller, on the other hand, burst out laughing. "Captain, you're kidding, right?" Hiller said, slapping his knee as if Marcus had just delivered the punchline to the best joke of the night. Onsen, however, wasn't laughing. His eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus more closely. Now searching for any sign that he might be lying, Marcus stood his ground, his face impassive, his posture steady. "But the crap!" Johnson snapped, his voice harsher now. "If you were our captain, we'd have known about it." "You'll find out in the morning," Marcus said evenly. "Now am I free to go, or do you plan to continue this conversation here?" Johnson's eyes darkened. It was clear that he didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he had just assumed was beneath him. But Marcus wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. For a moment it seemed like Johnson might press further, might escalate the situation just to prove a point. But then he backed off, shoving Marcus's license and registration back into his hands. "Get out of here," Johnson muttered. "And don't let us catch you speeding or you'll be in for a hell of a lot more than a stop next time." Arcus nodded, not bothering to respond to the threat. He turned and climbed back into his car, his hand steady on the steering wheel, his expression calm as he pulled away from the shoulder and back onto the road. He caught a glimpse of the two officers in his rearview mirror still standing there watching him go. They had no idea what was coming, but tomorrow they would. The sound of gravel crunching under his boots echoed in Marcus's ears as he stood in the cool night air. The patrol car's lights still flashed in rhythmic pulses behind him, casting long shadows on the deserted road. Arcus felt a tightening in his chest, not from fear but from the rising tension in the air. This wasn't going to be just a routine traffic stop. It was never that simple. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the unspoken challenge from the two officers standing before him, Officer Johnson and Officer Miller. Two names. Arcus would not forget hands where I can see them. Johnson ordered, stepping closer, his smirk unwavering. The officer was clearly enjoying himself, his authority something he wielded not with professionalism, but with mockery. "Don't make any sudden moves now. I wouldn't want to mistake you for a threat." Arcus complied, raising his hand slowly, his face expressionless. He had learned a long time ago that showing anger or defiance in moments like these could lead to disaster. He stood silently as Johnson circled him like a predator, sizing up its prey. Miller remained by the patrol car, his arms crossed and eyes gleaming with amusement as he watched the scene unfold. "You said you're starting some job in town, right?" Johnson's tone was mocking, his words dripping with condescension. "Captain, was it you who expected me to believe that?" Miller snorted from the side, barely containing his laughter. "Captain, man, I've heard some stories in my time, but that one takes the cake. Looks like we got ourselves a real comedian." Marcus remained silent, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't take the bait. Every muscle in his body was tense, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was a game he had played before, one he knew he had to endure without losing his temper. Johnson stepped even closer, so close now that Marcus could smell the faint trace of aftershave, mixed with the stale scent of cigarette smoke. The officer's grin widened, and his eyes flicked over Marcus's figure before landing on his face again. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Johnson asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, rolling into our town in a fancy car, talking big. "But you're just like every other punk who thinks he can do what he wants because of who he is. Guess what? You're no different." Marcus clenched his jaw, refusing to give in to the anger simmering beneath the surface. He had faced worse. This was nothing compared to the situations he had been in before. He was in control, always in control. Johnson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an apple. He tossed it lightly in his hand, the smirk on his face growing. "Well, you know what? Let's make this interesting," he said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. He took a step back and held the apple up to Marcus's face, his eyes gleaming with cruel intent. "Hold this," Johnson ordered, pressing the apple into Marcus's hand, confused. Marcus looked down at the fruit, wondering where this was headed. Johnson laughed, clearly relishing the confusion on Marcus's face. "So on," he said, stepping back even further, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Put it on your head." For the first time, Marcus's calm wavered. He stared at Johnson, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't move. The officer's smirk faltered for a second before he leaned in closer, his voice suddenly colder. "Did I stutter?" Johnson's voice was now sharp, threatening. "Put it on your head now." Marcus's mind raced. He knew exactly what this was. A deliberate act of humiliation, an attempt to strip him of his dignity. They wanted to break him, to make him lose his composure, to give them a reason to escalate this stop into something far more dangerous. The smart thing to do would be to comply, to avoid confrontation, but the smart thing to do would be to comply, to avoid confrontation. But the thought of playing along with this cruel game of putting that apple on his head like some kind of target made Marcus's blood boil. Still, he had learned long ago to pick his battles, and this wasn't the place to fight. Slowly, Marcus raised the apple and placed it on top of his head, his movement steady and deliberate. On, and Miller exchanged grins, the satisfaction of their victory written all over their faces. Arcus stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his jaw tight as he stared straight ahead, refusing to meet their mocking gazes. Johnson took a few steps back, tapping his gun holster as if considering his next move. "You know," he said, his voice loud and taunting, "I've always wondered if I could hit a target like that from here. What do you think, Miller?" "Do? Do you think I could do it?" Iller laughed again, leaning casually against the patrol car. "Oh, I don't know, man. That's a pretty small target. It might be tough even for a pro like you." Johnson's hand hovered near his gun, his fingers flexing slightly. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't move or act. He knew better than to escalate the situation. He could see the malice in Johnson's eyes, the sadistic thrill of power that the officer was basking in. This isn't about the law anymore. This is about control, about proving who had the upper hand. The night air was thick with tension. The only sound, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the occasional hum of a distant car passing by. Marcus's mind raced through every possible outcome. He knew that the slightest misstep could turn this encounter deadly, but he also knew he couldn't let them see him sweat. Johnson finally stepped back, his hand moving away from his gun, though the smirk never left his face. "Ah," he said with a laugh, waving dismissively. "I'll let you off easy this time. I wouldn't want to make a mess out here on the highway with such paperwork." Miller chuckled, shaking his head as if they had just shared an inside joke. "Yeah, I wouldn't want that. Plus it's late. E.T. Our friend here has to get some rest before his big day tomorrow." Johnson stepped closer again, reaching out to snatch the apple off Marcus's head. He tossed it into the dirt, letting it roll away before turning back to Marcus, his smile still twisted with cruelty. "You can go now," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Consider that your lucky break." Marcus stood frozen for a moment. The humiliation of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he remained stoic, his face impassive as he lowered his hands and stepped toward his car. He opened the door, sliding back into the driver's seat without a word. His heart still pounded in his chest, but outwardly, he remained calm. He had learned long ago to hide the storm inside as Marcus started the engine. Johnson leaned down to the open window. "One last time," his voice low. "Don't think we won't be watching, Captain," he sneered. "We'll be keeping a close eye on you without waiting for a response." Johnson turned and sauntered back to his patrol car, his laughter mingling with Miller's as they climbed inside. The red and blue lights still flashed in the darkness as Marcus pulled back onto the road. His hand gripping the steering wheel tightly in the rearview mirror, he watched as the patrol car remained parked for a moment before finally turning off the flashing lights and speeding off into the distance. Marcus exhaled slowly. The tension still gnawed in his chest. He knew this wasn't over. Tomorrow, when he walked into that station in his new role as captain, Johnson and Miller would be there, and things would be different. He had endured their taunts, their humiliation, because he knew what was at stake. But this wasn't just about enduring, it was about taking control. As the highway stretched out before him once again, Marcus felt the weight of the night lifting slightly. His eyes were focused. Straight ahead, his mind was already calculating his next move. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day when he would remind those officers exactly who they had been dealing with. The first light of dawn had begun to creep over the horizon. By the time Marcus reached the edge of town, the sky shifted from deep black to shades of gray and lavender, though the events of the night still weighed heavily on his mind. Every detail of the encounter with Johnson and Miller replayed in his head. The smugness in their voices, the apple on his head, the threat that hung unspoken between them. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter. He had stayed calm, as he always did, but the anger simmered beneath his composed exterior, waiting to be channeled into something productive. He had spent his entire career preparing for moments like these, not the humiliations, but the opportunities that arose from them. He knew he couldn't afford to lash out in the moment that wasn't the way change happened. Change came when people least expected it, when the ones in power realized that the person they had tried to crush was now the one holding the reins. As Marcus's car rolled into town, the streets were still quiet. A few coffee shops were just beginning to open, and shop owners unlocked doors and swept sidewalks preparing for the day ahead. Marcus drove past it, focused on the next steps. The small police station sat near the heart of town, a nondescript brick building that looked more like a post office than a place where law was enforced. But inside that building, Marcus knew were the two men who had tried to degrade him the night before, and a team of officers waiting to see what kind of man their new captain would be. He pulled into the parking lot of his hotel, a small roadside and just a few minutes from the police station after checking in. He dropped off his bags, took a quick shower and changed into his neatly pressed uniform. The captain's insignia gleamed on his chest, a subtle but unmistakable symbol of the authority he now carried. He stood in front of the mirror for a moment, adjusting his collar, making sure every detail was perfect. There was no room for mistakes. Not today. By the time Marcus arrived at the police station, the sun was fully up, casting a warm golden light over the building. He stepped out of his car with purpose, his polished boots clicking against the pavement as he approached the entrance. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and freshly cut grass. It was the kind of morning that normally felt full of possibility, but Marcus knew better than to expect a warm welcome inside. The front desk officer, a young man with sandy hair and wide eyes, looked up as Marcus entered. His gaze flicked from Marcus's face to the captain's badge pinned to his chest, and his expression quickly shifted from curiosity to mild panic. Good morning, sir," the officer stammered, straightening in his chair. "Captain Williams, right. They weren't expecting you this early." Marcus gave a polite nod. "I like to be early." He glanced around the station. It was small, but efficient. Desks neatly arranged, radios buzzing softly in the background. A few officers were already at their stations, sipping coffee and glancing at reports. Conversations that had been easy and relaxed a moment ago began to hush as Marcus's presence registered. The room grew quieter with each passing second, attention settling over the space, and then from the far side of the room, Marcus saw them. Johnson and Miller were standing near the bulletin board, engaged in quiet conversation, their postures relaxed and confident. They hadn't noticed him yet. Marcus took a moment to observe them. How at ease they were, how certain they seemed that nothing in their world had changed since the night before. He began to walk toward them, each step deliberate. His boots echoed on the tile floor, drawing attention with every click. Johnson noticed first. His head turned slightly, and for a moment, his expression remained neutral. But then recognition flickered in his eyes, and the color drained from his face. His relaxed stance stiffened, and the smirk that had been so prominent the night before vanished entirely. Miller noticed the change in his partner and followed his gaze. When his eyes landed on Marcus, his reaction was almost comical. A double take followed by a flash of disbelief that quickly turned into discomfort. "Well, good morning," Marcus said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to cut through the silence in the room. Johnson, Miller, neither officer spoke. They exchanged uneasy glances. Their previous bravado replaced with something closer to dread. It was one thing to taunt a stranger on the road. It was another to realize that the same man now stood before them, not as a powerless civilian, but as their superior. Marcus let the silence linger, enjoying the discomfort that hung between them like a heavy fog. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he broke the stillness. "I believe you both had the pleasure of meeting me last night." Marcus continued, his voice calm but edged with a subtle sharpness. "Though I suspect you didn't know who I was at the time." Johnson cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. We didn't realize, sir." "No," Mark replied smoothly. "You didn't, but you know now, don't you?" Miller shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. Johnson, still struggling to regain some semblance of composure, tried to offer a weak smile. It was just a misunderstanding. "Captain, we were just—" Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't want to hear your excuses." His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. "What I care about is how things are going to be moving forward. As of today, I'm in charge, and things will change." The officers in the room exchanged glances, some curious, others cautious. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, but he welcomed it. This was his moment to set the tone, to make it clear that he wasn't here to play games. "I expect professionalism from every single one of you," Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping over the room. "That means no more games, no more disrespect, and no more abuse of authority." "Understood." The silence stretched heavy and uncomfortable. Johnson and Miller both nodded, though their expressions betrayed their resentment. Marcus didn't care. He wasn't here to be liked. He was here to lead good. Marcus said, his voice steady, There will be an internal review of your conduct last night. Independent observers will be brought in to ensure transparency. I trust you'll cooperate fully." The color drained further from Johnson's face, and Miller looked as though he might be sick. Marcus let the moment sink in before turning on his heel and addressing the rest of the room. "I'll be in my office if anyone needs me," he announced, his tone neutral but firm. "Get back to work." With that, Marcus walked toward the captain's office at the far end of the station, leaving the stunned officers in his wake. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't look back. The doors to his office closed behind him with a satisfying click, sealing off the tension from the room outside. He stood for a moment, letting the silence wash over him. The encounter had gone exactly as he had expected. He had set the tone, made it clear who was in charge, and planted the seeds for the changes that would follow. It was only the beginning, but it was a start. The sun shone brightly over the police station as Marcus sat in his office, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights blending with the quiet shuffle of papers outside his door. He had arrived early, but now the station was awake with activity. Officers filed in, some talking quietly in groups, others already busy with morning assignments. Yet the tension in the air was undeniable. Marcus leaned back in his chair, surveying the office that was now his domain. The furniture was basic, a sturdy desk, a file cabinet, and a few chairs, but the significance of the space was not lost on him. This office symbolized more than authority. It was a challenge, a place where he would prove not only his competence, but also his resilience in the face of inevitable resistance. A knock at the door broke the silence. Marcus didn't respond immediately, letting the moment stretch. Another knock followed, more hesitant this time. "Come in," Marcus said, his voice measured. The door creaked open, and Officer Johnson stepped inside, his usual bravado noticeably absent behind him. Miller hovered awkwardly in the doorway, as if reluctant to enter the lion's den. Marcus motioned towards the two chairs in front of his desk. "Have a seat." The officers exchanged glances before reluctantly sitting down. Miller looked as if he would rather be anywhere else, while Johnson tried and failed to maintain an air of nonchalance. Marcus folded his hands on the desk, meeting their gazes steadily. "Let's get one thing straight," he began, his tone calm but firm. "I'm not here to settle personal scores. What happened last night? Consider it addressed. But from this moment forward, things will change. I'll make sure of that." Johnson shifted in his seat. "With all due respect, Captain, we didn't mean to." Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. Whatever you were going to say won't matter. What matters is your conduct from this point on." Miller opened his mouth as if to speak, but thought better of it. Marcus's unwavering gaze seemed to strip away any lingering bravado they had brought with them. "There will be an investigation," Marcus continued. "Independent observers will review the incident from last night, and I expect full cooperation from both of you. Any resistance or lack of transparency will not be tolerated." Johnson swallowed hard, clearly grasping the seriousness of Marcus's words, and understood. Captain Good Marcus replied, leaning forward slightly, "And let me be clear about one thing. I won't tolerate any form of misconduct under my command, whether that's harassment, discrimination, or abuse of power. Do I make myself clear?" Both officers nodded, though their faces were tight with resentment. Marcus could sense the storm of emotions, brewing beneath their calm exteriors, resentment, frustration, and perhaps even fear. He wasn't naive. He knew that change, especially the kind of change he intended to bring, would come with resistance, but he was prepared for it. Marcus rose from his chair, signaling the end of the meeting. "You're dismissed." Johnson and Miller stood offering curt nods before turning to leave as the door clicked shut behind them. Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The encounter had gone exactly as he intended. Ed was calm, professional, and unyielding. He had set the tone. Now it was up to them to decide how they would respond. Out in the main office, the atmosphere remained tense. Conversations hushed whenever Marcus stepped into the room, and eyes followed him wherever he went. Some officers greeted him with guarded smiles, others with polite but distant nods. It was clear that his arrival had sent ripples through the department, and those ripples were beginning to stir the waters in ways Marcus had anticipated as he moved through the station. Marcus took note of everything: the way files were organized, the interactions between officers, and the subtle hierarchies that existed within the team. He spotted a few officers who seemed genuinely curious about him. Their expressions lacked the resentment he had seen in Johnson and Miller. These were the ones he would focus on in the coming weeks, the officers who could become allies in his efforts to reshape the department. In the break room, a group of younger officers sat together, talking quietly over coffee. When Marcus entered, the conversation abruptly stopped, and the room fell into an awkward silence. Marcus offered them a nod, grabbed a cup of black coffee, and leaned against the counter. "You don't have to stop talking because of me," he said, his tone light but intentional. One of the younger officers, a woman with dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, smiled nervously. "We were just getting ready for the morning briefing." Marcus took a sip of his coffee. "Good. I'll see you all there." He left the break room, his mind already working through the morning's agenda. There was a lot to do: policies to review, procedures to streamline, and most importantly, a culture to change. He knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was ready for the long game. Change took time, and Marcus was willing to invest every moment necessary to see it through. Back in his office, Marcus began reviewing the department's internal files. As he scanned through reports and incident logs, patterns started to emerge, patterns that confirmed what he had suspected. There were too many cases of questionable conduct, too many incidents swept under the rug. It was clear that the department had operated under an LAX standard for far too long that was about to end. He made a few notes marking key areas for immediate attention. Johnson and Miller's conduct from the previous night would not be an isolated incident. Their behavior reflected a deeper issue within the department, one that Marcus was determined to address head-on. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was the young officer from the break room. She stood in the doorway holding a folder. "Captain, I thought you might want to see this," she said, handing him the file. Marcus opened it and scanned the contents. It was a summary of recent complaints filed by civilians, complaints that had gone unresolved or were dismissed without proper investigation. "Thank you," Marcus said, setting the file on his desk. "What's your name, Officer Sanders?" "Sir, well, Officer Sanders," Marcus said, offering a small but genuine smile. "I appreciate your initiative. Keep it up." She nodded, seeming both surprised and pleased by the compliment, before excusing herself as the door closed behind her. Marcus returned his attention to the file. The complaints painted a clear picture of a department that had long operated without accountability, but that was about to change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and briefings. Marcus made it a point to observe, listen, and learn. He took mental notes on which officers seemed resistant to his presence, and which ones might be open to his leadership. It was too soon to know for sure, but Marcus had a knack for reading people, and he trusted his instincts as the sun began to set. Marcus sat back in his chair, exhausted but satisfied. The first day had gone as well as he could have hoped. He had established his presence, set expectations, and made it clear that things were going to change. There would be resistance, of course. There always was, but Marcus was ready for it. He glanced out the window, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and purple. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Marcus knew he was exactly where he needed to be. This was only the beginning. The following morning, Marcus arrived at the station to find the atmosphere even more tense than before. Word had already spread about the investigation into Johnson and Miller's behavior, and whispers filled the halls. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what was coming next. While others feigned indifference, burying themselves in paperwork, no one could ignore the quiet shift in the air, a shift that Marcus had deliberately set in motion as he entered the building. Marcus's sharp gaze swept over the room. Johnson and Miller were both at their desks, their postures stiff, their eyes trained on their monitors as if trying to appear unaffected. But Marcus could feel the tension radiating off them, and it was clear that the investigation was weighing heavily on their minds. The pressure was building, and they knew it. Marcus walked straight to his office, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. He didn't need to make a show of force. His presence alone was enough to unsettle those who were already on edge. This was the moment when things would start to shift, and he was ready to take the next step. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Marcus called, his voice firm but calm. The door opened, and Lieutenant Harris stepped inside. Harris was one of the few senior officers. Marcus had taken note of a man known for his professionalism and dedication to the job. He had kept a low profile during Marcus's first day, but now he stood in front of the captain with a serious expression on his face. Captain Harris began his tone respectful but direct. "I wanted to let you know that the independent observers have arrived. They're ready to begin the investigation into the incident with Officers Johnson and Miller." Marcus nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Good. Make sure they have full access to any and all records they need. I want complete transparency." Harris gave a quick nod of understanding. "Understood, sir. And if I may, there's been some unrest among the officers. A few of them aren't taking too kindly to this investigation. They think it's overkill." Marcus met Harris's gaze steadily, his expression unreadable. "They are entitled to their opinions, but make no mistake, this investigation is necessary. We can't afford to let behavior like that go unchecked, not under my command." Harris shifted slightly, his brows furrowing. "I agree, sir, but you should be aware Johnson and Miller have a lot of allies in the department. They've been here a long time, and some of the other officers might see this as you coming down too hard on them." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Is that a warning?" "Lieutenant, no, sir," Harris said quickly. "Just an observation. I know you're new here, and the department has its ways of doing things, but you should know that change, especially the kind of change you're bringing, won't sit well with everyone." Marcus considered Harris's words for a moment. He had expected this, the resistance, the quiet alliances formed out of fear or loyalty. It was part of the process, but he wouldn't be swayed by it. "I appreciate the insight, Harris," Marcus said finally. "But let me make one thing clear. I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to run a department that upholds the law, that respects the people it serves. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly. But I won't tolerate misconduct, and I won't look the other way." Harris nodded, his expression. "Resolute, understood, Captain. I'll make sure the observers get what they need." As Harris left the office, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. He knew that pushing for accountability would come with consequences, but he had never been one to back down from a fight, and this fight was far from over. Later that day, the independent observers, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in sharp business attire, began their work. They moved through the station with quiet efficiency, requesting files, reviewing footage, and interviewing officers. Their presence caused a ripple of unease, especially among those who had long operated under the assumption that their actions would never be questioned. Marcus kept a close eye on the proceedings from his office, stepping out occasionally to speak with the observers or check in on the progress. He could see the subtle shift in the demeanor of the officers, those who were nervous, those who were irritated, and those who seemed resigned to the fact that change was coming whether they liked it or not. The investigation progressed quickly. Johnson and Miller were called in for questioning, their discomfort palpable as they made their way to the interview room. Marcus watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable, as they disappeared behind closed doors. This was their moment of reckoning. Hours later, when the observers emerged from their final round of interviews, their expressions were grim but professional. One of them, a tall man with glasses, approached Marcus in the hallway. "Captain Williams, we've completed our preliminary review," he said, his voice measured. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, it's clear that the behavior of Officers Johnson and Miller during the incident was inappropriate and in violation of department policy. We'll be recommending disciplinary action." Maris nodded, though he had already expected this outcome. "What kind of disciplinary action are we looking at?" "At the very least, both officers will receive formal reprimands and be placed on temporary suspension pending further investigation." The observer replied, "It's also possible that additional training or other corrective measures will be required depending on the findings of the internal review." Marcus felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about punishing Johnson and Miller out of spite. It was about setting a standard and making it clear that abuse of power would not be tolerated. This was the first step toward restoring accountability within the department. "Thank you," Marcus said. "I'll make sure it's handled appropriately," as the observers left the building. Marcus returned to his office feeling the weight of what had just transpired. The consequences for Johnson and Miller would send a message to the entire department, a message that Marcus intended to follow through on with conviction. By the time the station began to quiet down for the evening, word had already spread about the disciplinary action. The mood was tense, with some officers offering tight-lipped comments. While others muttered their discontent, Marcus walked through the station, his presence alone enough to quiet the murmurs, but he could feel the simmering resentment beneath the surface. He stopped at his office door and turned to face the officers gathered near the break room. They looked up at him, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in their eyes. "You've all heard the news by now," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the room. "Johnson and Miller are being disciplined for their actions. This department has a responsibility to uphold the law, not just for the people we serve, but for ourselves as well." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I understand that some of you may not agree with the decision, and that's fine. You're entitled to your opinions, but let me be clear. My job is to ensure that we operate with integrity, that we treat each other and the people in this town with respect. If that's a problem for anyone, I suggest you speak to me directly." The room was silent. Marcus scanned the faces of the officers, reading the emotions that flickered across their features. Defiance, frustration, uncertainty. But he also saw something else: understanding. Some of them at least seemed to realize that this wasn't about punishment for its own sake. It was about setting a new standard. With that, Marcus turned and walked back into his office, the door closing behind him with a finality that left the officers outside to contemplate what had just been said inside. Marcus sat down at his desk, exhaling slowly. He knew this wasn't the end. Far from it, the investigation would continue, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for now, he had made his stance clear. This was his department now, and things were going to change. The day after the disciplinary actions were announced, the mood at the station remained uneasy. The ripple effect of Marcus's decisions was felt throughout the department. Some officers moved with quiet resentment, their routines more rigid than usual, while others appeared cautiously optimistic, sensing that something important was shifting beneath the surface. Marcus could feel it too, a subtle but undeniable change in the air. The old ways were being challenged, and while resistance still lingered, there was also a growing sense of accountability taking root. As Marcus sat in his office, the door opened to the bustle of the station. A tap on the frame caught his attention. Lieutenant Harris stood there, a report in hand. Captain Harris began stepping inside the formal suspensions for Johnson and Miller. They have been given temporary leave, and their records have been updated with the reprimands. He handed over the report. Marcus took the file, flipping through it. "Good," he said without looking up. "That's a start." "They weren't happy," Harris added with a hint of amusement. "But they didn't have much choice given the evidence." Marcus offered a faint smile, more out of satisfaction than joy. "No, I imagine they didn't," with a nod. Harris excused himself, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The actions against Johnson and Miller were more than just disciplinary measures. They were a signal to the entire department: abuse of power would not be tolerated, and justice would not be optional. This was how real change began, not with sweeping speeches, but with small, deliberate actions that set a new tone and made clear what was no longer acceptable. Later that afternoon, Marcus made a point to walk through the station, taking the time to speak with officers individually. He didn't deliver grand lectures or force conversations. Instead, he asked about their work, inquired about pending cases, and offered guidance where needed. Some responded, with cold politeness, still wary of the new captain. Others, however, seemed to appreciate his approach. Officer Sanders in particular had already begun to emerge as a reliable and thoughtful officer. Marcus made a mental note to keep an eye on her. She had potential, the kind of potential the department needed if it was going to rebuild itself properly. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the station had begun to shift. It was subtle, just a little less tension, a little more openness. Marcus knew the process would take time. He wasn't here for quick fixes. He was here to build something lasting, something that could withstand the challenges ahead. The real test came 2 days later. Marcus was in his office reviewing case files when he heard a commotion outside. He stood and walked to the door, finding a cluster of officers gathered near the front desk. At the center of the commotion were Johnson and Miller, their uniforms wrinkled from travel, their expressions a mixture of defiance and frustration. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm as he approached. Johnson turned, and for a brief moment, the smugness returned to his expression. "We've got some friends in higher places." "Captain," he said with a sneer, "they're not too happy about how you've been running things around here." Miller, standing just behind him, crossed his arms and added, "They're talking about bringing in someone else. Maybe a captain who knows how to handle a station like this." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unimpressed that so Johnson smiled, clearly expecting Marcus to back down to second-guess his authority. But Marcus had faced bigger threats than these two before, and he wasn't about to be intimidated now. "Let me explain something to you," Marcus said, his tone even and deliberate. "This station isn't going back to the way it was. Not today, not ever. If you think pulling strings with old friends is going to change that, you're mistaken." Johnson's smirk faltered just slightly. Marcus took a step closer, his gaze locked on both men. "You've been given a chance to learn from your mistakes," Marcus continued. "What you do with that chance is up to you, but make no mistake, if I catch even a hint of misconduct from either of you going forward, you won't just be facing suspension, you'll be out with no way back. Understood?" The tension between them was palpable, but Marcus didn't blink. This was the moment of truth. Either they would accept the new order, or they would break under the pressure of their own pride. Johnson and Miller exchanged a look for a moment. It seemed as if they might challenge him further, but then slowly, grudgingly, they nodded, yes. Captain Johnson muttered. The fight drained from his voice. Marcus held their gaze a moment longer before giving a curt nod. "Good. Now get back to work." The two officers slunk away, their bravado deflated. The other officers who had been watching the scene unfold quickly dispersed, returning to their tasks. Marcus stood there for a moment watching the room settle. It was a small victory, but an important one. The power struggle had reached its climax, and Marcus had come out on top, not through intimidation but through quiet, unyielding resolve. He returned to his office, closing the door behind him. For the first time since arriving at the station, he allowed himself a brief moment to relax. The hardest part was over. The foundation had been laid. Now it was time to build. In the weeks that followed, the department began to transform. There were still challenges, still moments of resistance, but little by little the culture shifted. Officers like Sanders and Harris stepped up, becoming the pillars of the new order Marcus was establishing, and even Johnson and Miller begrudgingly at first began to fall in line. Marcus didn't seek applause or recognition for what he had accomplished. He didn't need it. His reward was in the small moments, the complaints that were taken seriously, the officers who treated each other with respect, the quiet sense of pride that began to grow within the department one evening as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing reports. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was a call from the mayor's office, a congratulatory message acknowledging the positive changes taking root at the station. Marcus thanked the mayor's assistant and hung up, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. It wasn't about a personal victory. It was about justice, about knowing that in a small but meaningful way he had made a difference. As Marcus locked up his office for the night and stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known. In a long time, the road ahead would still be long with plenty of challenges along the way. But for now, he knew one thing for certain. He had set out to make a change, and he had succeeded. Justice finally had been restored. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Check out our other videos and stay tuned for the next one. It's just around the corner. Where are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments.